The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., but Kai and Kyle were already awake. The 19-year-old twins had barely slept, excited about returning to college after spending 2 weeks at home. Their mom had made their favorite breakfast, pancakes with fresh strawberries, and packed them extra snacks for the flight. "Don't forget to call me when you land," their mother said, hugging them tightly at the front door. She always worried when they traveled, even though the boys were responsible and mature beyond their years. The ride to Chicago O'Hare Airport was quiet. Both boys were thinking about the semester ahead. Kai was studying business and had a big presentation coming up about startup companies. Kyle was focused on his engineering courses and couldn't wait to get back to his robotics project. They had always been close, sharing everything from clothes to dreams about their future. At 19, the twins looked exactly alike. Same height, same smile, same way of walking. People often got confused about who was who, which the brothers found amusing. They had learned to use this to their advantage during college, sometimes switching classes just for fun. The airport was already busy when they arrived at 6 a.m. Business travelers rushed past with their rolling suitcases. Families struggled with strollers and car seats, and college students like themselves headed back to school with oversized backpacks. Kai pulled out his phone to check their boarding passes one more time. "First class, seats 2A and 2B, he said, with a grin. "Dad really spoiled us this time." Kyle laughed. "I'm not complaining. Those economy seats are terrible for tall people like us." Their father had surprised them with the first-class tickets. He said it was a reward for their excellent grades last semester. Both boys had made the dean's list, and their parents were incredibly proud. The upgrade meant they could stretch out during the 5-hour flight to California and maybe get some studying done. The check-in process went smoothly. The airline employee at the counter was friendly and efficient. She looked at their IDs, printed their baggage tags, and wished them a pleasant flight. Security took a bit longer than usual. It always seemed to during busy travel times, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. While waiting at their gate, the twins grabbed coffee and breakfast, sandwiches from a nearby cafe. The terminal was filling up with morning travelers, and the energy was contagious. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere important. Gate 47B, now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 447 to Los Angeles. The announcement echoed through the terminal. Kyle gathered his backpack and laptop bag. "That's us," he said, standing up and stretching. They had flown many times before. Their family traveled often for vacations and to visit relatives. The boys were comfortable in airports and knew the routine. Show your boarding pass, find your seat, stow your luggage, and settle in for the journey. As they walked toward the gate, Kai noticed how nice the plane looked through the window. It was one of the newer aircraft in the fleet, with updated interiors and entertainment systems. He was looking forward to watching a movie during the flight. The gate agent scanned their boarding passes without any issues. She smiled and told them to enjoy their flight. Everything seemed normal and routine, just like the dozens of other flights they had taken over the years. Walking down the jet bridge, Kyle was already thinking about what he would order for the in-flight meal. First-class passengers got real food, not just peanuts and pretzels. His stomach was growling despite the breakfast sandwich he had eaten earlier. The twins had no idea that this ordinary Tuesday morning would become anything but ordinary. They were just two college students heading back to school, grateful for their comfortable seats and excited about the semester ahead. Behind them, other first-class passengers boarded the plane. There was a businessman talking loudly on his phone about some important deal. An elderly couple was discussing their vacation plans. A woman in a designer suit was reviewing documents in a leather folder. Everyone looked different, came from different backgrounds, and was traveling for different reasons. But they all had one thing in common: valid tickets and the right to be on that plane. Kai and Kyle approached the aircraft door, where a flight attendant usually stood to greet passengers. They could see her uniform through the doorway, the familiar navy blue blazer with the airline's logo pinned to the lapel. The twins were polite young men, raised to say please and thank you, and to treat everyone with respect. Their parents had taught them well. They always smiled at flight attendants, gate agents, and anyone else who helped make their travel experience smooth. "Good morning," Kyle said as they stepped onto the plane, ready to show their boarding passes to the flight attendant. What happened next would change everything, not just for their flight that day, but for their understanding of the world around them. Sometimes life teaches you lessons when you least expect them, and sometimes those lessons come in the most shocking ways. The twins had grown up in a comfortable bubble, surrounded by love and success. They attended good schools, lived in a nice neighborhood, and had parents who could afford first-class tickets. They had experienced small moments of unfairness before, but nothing that really shook their world. That was about to change in a way they never could have imagined. Their ordinary Tuesday morning flight was about to become extraordinary, and not in a good way. The lesson they were about to learn would stay with them forever and change how they saw themselves and the world around them. As they stood in the doorway of the aircraft, boarding passes in hand, smiles on their faces, they had no idea that they were about to face something that would test everything they believed about fairness, justice, and human decency. The story that was about to unfold would shock everyone who heard it, including their own father, who at that very moment was sitting in his office, completely unaware that his sons were about to become the center of a controversy that would make headlines around the world. The flight attendant looked up from her clipboard as Kai and Kyle approached. Her name tag read, Patricia, and she had been working for the airline for over 15 years. She had seen thousands of passengers board planes, but something about these two young men made her pause. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice sharp and unfriendly. "Can I see your boarding passes?" The twins looked at each other, surprised by her tone. They had just shown their passes to the gate agent moments earlier, but they politely handed them over anyway. Patricia studied the passes carefully, turning them over and holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "These are first-class seats," she said, her eyebrows raised in suspicion. "Yes, ma'am," Kai replied politely. "Seats 2A and 2B. "Are you sure these belong to you?" Patricia asked, her voice getting louder. Several passengers behind the twins stopped to watch what was happening. Kyle felt his face getting warm. "Yes, these are our seats. Is there a problem?" Patricia called over to another flight attendant, a younger woman named Lisa who had been preparing the first-class cabin for departure. "Lisa, come look at this," she said in a voice that carried throughout the front of the plane. Lisa walked over, clearly uncomfortable with the situation that was developing. She looked at the boarding passes and then at the twins. "Everything looks correct to me," she said quietly. "I need to verify these tickets," Patricia announced, loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear. "There must be some kind of mistake." The twins stood in the aisle, blocking other passengers from boarding. People were starting to get impatient, and some were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The situation was becoming more embarrassing by the minute. "Ma'am, we checked in at the counter and went through security with these same boarding passes," Kai explained, trying to keep his voice calm. "The gate agent already checked them too." Patricia ignored his explanation and picked up the phone to call the gate. "This is Patricia on Flight 447. I have 2 passengers here claiming to have first-class tickets, but I need someone to verify their identity and payment method." Kyle couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Claiming to have tickets? We're showing you our boarding passes right now." "Sir, I need you to lower your voice," Patricia said firmly. "You're being disruptive." The twins exchanged confused looks. They hadn't raised their voices or done anything disruptive. They were simply trying to board a plane with valid tickets, just like every other passenger. Other first-class passengers were starting to complain about the delay. A businessman in an expensive suit pushed past the twins and took his seat, shooting them an annoyed look. An elderly woman whispered to her husband about those boys causing trouble. Lisa, the younger flight attendant, looked increasingly uncomfortable. She had worked with Patricia before and knew her tendency to be suspicious of certain passengers, but this seemed especially unfair. The twins were well-dressed, polite, and had valid boarding passes. She couldn't understand why Patricia was making such a scene. "Patricia, maybe we should just let them sit down," Lisa suggested quietly. "The captain wants us to close the door soon." "No," Patricia said firmly. Something doesn't feel right about this. I'm not letting anyone sit in first class until I know for sure they belong there. Kai felt his hand shaking with frustration and embarrassment. He had never been treated like this before. What exactly do you need to verify? We have our boarding passes, our IDs, and our credit cards if you need to see them. I don't need to explain my security procedures to you, Patricia replied. Please step aside and wait while I sort this out. The twins moved to the side of the galley area, feeling humiliated as other passengers filed past them. Some people stared openly, while others pretended not to notice the drama unfolding. A few passengers looked sympathetic, but no one spoke up to defend them. Kyle watched as a young man about their age, wearing ripped jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, walked past them and took a first-class seat without being questioned. The contrast wasn't lost on him. He and his brother were dressed nicely in collared shirts and dress pants, yet they were the ones being treated like criminals. Patricia spent nearly 10 minutes on the phone with various airline personnel. The twins could hear her side of the conversation, and it became clear that everyone she spoke to confirmed that their tickets were legitimate. The reservation had been paid for with a valid credit card, the passengers had checked in properly, and there were no red flags in the system. Despite this confirmation, Patricia seemed reluctant to let them board. She kept asking for additional verification, insisting that something still didn't feel right about the situation. Other passengers were becoming increasingly impatient. The departure time had already passed, and people were worried about missing connections at their destination. Some started asking flight attendants when they would be taking off. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay due to a boarding issue, the captain announced over the intercom. We should be departing shortly. Kai felt sick to his stomach. He realized that he and his brother were the boarding issue the captain was referring to. Dozens of people were being delayed because a flight attendant refused to accept their valid tickets. Finally, a supervisor arrived from the gate to speak with Patricia. The twins couldn't hear everything they discussed, but they saw the supervisor shake her head several times and point to the boarding passes. It seemed like she was trying to convince Patricia to let them board. But Patricia wasn't backing down. She crossed her arms and shook her head firmly, clearly unwilling to change her position. The supervisor looked frustrated and asked to speak with the captain. This is ridiculous, Kyle whispered to his brother. We've done nothing wrong. I know, Kai replied quietly. Let's just stay calm and let them figure it out. The twins had been raised to respect authority and avoid confrontation. Their parents had taught them to be polite and patient, even when faced with unfair treatment. But this situation was testing those values in a way they had never experienced before. As they stood in the galley, watching other passengers settle into seats that they should have been occupying, the twins couldn't help but wonder if this would be happening if they looked different. The thought was painful, but it was becoming harder to ignore. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the captain himself appeared in the doorway. He was a tall man with gray hair and a serious expression. He looked at the twins, then at Patricia, then at the boarding passes that had been verified multiple times. What he said next would determine whether the twins would make it home to college that day, or whether their journey would take a very different and much more difficult turn. Captain Rodriguez looked tired and irritated as he approached the galley where Kai and Kyle had been waiting. He had been flying for 23 years and had dealt with countless boarding disputes, but he wanted to get his flight in the air as soon as possible. What's the situation here? He asked Patricia, barely glancing at the twins. Patricia launched into her concerns, speaking quickly and dramatically. These two passengers are claiming to have first-class tickets, but something just doesn't add up. I have a feeling about these things, Captain. In my 15 years of experience, I've learned to trust my instincts. The captain looked at the boarding passes that had been verified multiple times by different airline employees. Everything appeared to be in order, but he could see that Patricia was not going to back down. He also noticed that other passengers were getting restless and checking their watches. Look, Captain Rodriguez said to the twins, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, but we need to get this flight moving. Would you be willing to take seats in the economy section? We can sort out the details once we're in the air. Kai felt his heart sink. But these are our assigned seats. We paid for first class and all our paperwork is correct. Why should we give up seats that belong to us? Sometimes these things happen, the captain replied with a shrug. We can work out compensation later, but right now I need to think about the other 200 passengers on this plane. Kyle couldn't believe what he was hearing. So you're asking us to give up our seats to make the flight attendant feel better, even though we've done nothing wrong? The captain's expression hardened. I'm asking you to be reasonable and cooperative. If you keep arguing, I'll have to consider you disruptive passengers. Lisa, the younger flight attendant, looked horrified. She had watched the entire situation unfold and couldn't understand why her colleague was being so unreasonable. The twins had been nothing but polite and patient throughout the ordeal. Captain, maybe we could just... Lisa began, but Patricia cut her off. These passengers have been argumentative from the moment they boarded, Patricia lied. They've been raising their voices and causing a disturbance. Kai's mouth fell open. That's not true at all. We've been standing here quietly while you questioned our tickets. Several passengers who had witnessed the entire situation began whispering among themselves. Some were recording with their phones, sensing that something unfair was happening. Others just wanted the drama to end so the flight could take off. An older gentleman in seat 1A spoke up. Excuse me, Captain, but I've been watching this whole thing. These young men haven't been disruptive at all. They've been very patient and polite. Patricia shot him an angry look. Sir, please don't interfere with airline security procedures. This isn't a security issue, the passenger replied firmly. This is just wrong. But Captain Rodriguez had made up his mind. He was facing pressure to get the flight moving, and the easiest solution seemed to be removing the source of conflict, even if that source was the victims of unfair treatment. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you two to leave the aircraft, he announced. Airport security will escort you off and customer service can help you with rebooking. The twins stared at him in shock. After 30 minutes of having their valid tickets questioned and verified multiple times, they were being thrown off the plane for no reason other than a flight attendant's unfounded suspicions. This is unbelievable, Kyle said, his voice shaking with emotion. We have done absolutely nothing wrong. Your refusal to cooperate is what's wrong, Patricia said smugly. I told you something didn't feel right about this situation. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the aircraft door. They looked uncomfortable with the situation, having been told only that there were disruptive passengers who needed to be removed. Gentlemen, we need you to gather your belongings and come with us, one of the officers said politely. Kai and Kyle looked around the first-class cabin at the other passengers. Some were staring openly, others were pretending to read magazines or look out the window. A few people were still recording with their phones, and the twins could see the sympathy in their eyes. The walk down the aisle felt like the longest journey of their lives. Every passenger on the plane watched as they were escorted off, their expensive luggage rolling behind them. The twins had never felt so humiliated and powerless. As they passed through the aircraft door, Kai heard Patricia tell another flight attendant, I knew something was off about those two from the moment I saw them. The security officers were kind as they escorted the twins through the terminal. I'm sorry about this, guys, one of them said quietly. Sometimes these airline disputes get out of hand. Back at the gate, the customer service representatives seemed just as baffled by the situation as everyone else. They looked at the twins' tickets and confirmed once again that everything was in order. I don't understand why you were removed from the aircraft, the gate agent said, shaking her head. These are valid first-class tickets, and your reservation shows no problems. So what happens now? Kyle asked, feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. Well, the next flight to Los Angeles doesn't leave until tomorrow morning, the agent replied. We can put you on that flight and provide hotel vouchers for tonight. Kai couldn't believe it. They were going to miss their first day of classes because a flight attendant didn't think they belonged in first class. All their studying materials were in their checked luggage, which was now on its way to California without them. As they sat in the terminal waiting area, both twins felt a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. They had been raised to believe that if you worked hard, followed the rules, and treated people with respect, you would be treated fairly in return. Today had shattered that belief. Other passengers from their flight walked by as they waited. Some stopped to express their sympathy and offer to serve as witnesses if the twins decided to file a complaint. Several people had recorded parts of the incident and offered to share their videos. "I can't believe that just happened," one woman said, shaking her head in disgust. "I've never seen anything so unfair in my life." A businessman who had been in first class approached them. "I want you to know that what happened to you was completely wrong," he said. "I travel constantly for work and I've never seen anyone's tickets questioned like that." As the twins sat there, surrounded by strangers offering support and encouragement, they realized that their experience had affected more people than just themselves. The injustice had been so obvious that even casual observers were outraged, but the twins had no idea that their humiliation was about to become much more public than they could have imagined. And they certainly had no idea that the person who could make things right was sitting in an office just a few miles away, completely unaware that his own sons had just become victims of discrimination on his own airline. David Thompson was reviewing quarterly financial reports in his corner office when his assistant knocked urgently on the door. After building Skyline Airways from a small regional carrier into one of the country's major airlines, David was used to handling crises, but something about his assistant's expression told him this was different. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this immediately," she said, holding up her phone with a shaking hand. David looked at the screen and felt his blood run cold. There, in a video that had already been viewed thousands of times, were his sons being escorted off one of his own aircraft by security officers. The caption read, "Shocking, twins with valid first-class tickets removed from plane for no reason." "When did this happen?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "About an hour ago. The video is going viral on social media. People are calling it blatant discrimination." David watched the video again, this time focusing on every detail. He could see Kai and Kyle's confused and hurt expressions as they gathered their belongings. He could hear other passengers expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Most painfully, he could see the dignity with which his sons handled the situation, even as they were being humiliated. His hands trembled as he immediately called Kai's phone. When his son answered, David could hear the exhaustion and hurt in his voice. "Dad, we were going to call you when we got to school, but, son, I just saw the video. Are you and your brother okay? Where are you right now?" Kai's voice broke slightly. "We're still at the airport. They put us on a flight for tomorrow morning. Dad, we didn't do anything wrong. We showed them our tickets, our IDs, everything, but the flight attendant just kept saying something didn't feel right." David closed his eyes, feeling a pain in his chest that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with being a father. His boys had been hurt, humiliated, and discriminated against by his own employees on his own aircraft. "I'm sending the company jet to pick you up right now," David said. "Don't move from where you are, and boys, I'm so sorry this happened to you." After hanging up, David called an emergency meeting with his senior vice presidents. Within 30 minutes, his conference room was filled with the airline's top executives, all looking confused and concerned about why they had been summoned so urgently. "I want everyone to watch this video," David said, projecting the footage onto the large screen at the front of the room. As the video played, David watched his executives' faces change from confusion to shock to horror. When it ended, the room was completely silent. "Those are my sons," David said quietly. "My boys were removed from our aircraft this morning because a flight attendant decided they didn't belong in first class, despite having valid tickets." The head of human resources spoke first. "David, I am so sorry, we had no idea." "That's exactly the problem," David interrupted. "We had no idea. If this can happen to my sons, who are well-dressed college students with first-class tickets, how many other passengers have been treated this way? How many incidents have we missed or ignored?" The vice president of operations pulled up the flight records on his laptop. "I'm looking at the crew assignments for that flight. The senior flight attendant was Patricia Coleman. She's been with us for 15 years. 15 years of what?" David asked angrily. 15 years of deciding who does and doesn't belong on our planes based on her personal prejudices?" David's assistant knocked and entered the room. Sir, the media is starting to call. Local news stations want a statement, and the story is spreading on social media very quickly. The head of public relations looked panicked. We need to control this narrative before it gets out of hand. Maybe we can frame it as a simple misunderstanding. Absolutely not, David said firmly. There will be no spin, no excuses, and no attempts to minimize what happened. My sons were discriminated against, period. And if it happened to them, it's happened to others. David's phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. Dad, we're okay. Please don't do anything that might hurt the company because of us. Reading that message broke David's heart even more. Even after being humiliated and mistreated, his sons were worried about protecting the business he had built. It showed the kind of young men they were, but it also made David even more determined to ensure this never happened again. I want Patricia Coleman fired immediately, David announced, along with the captain who supported her decision and anyone in management who failed to properly address previous complaints about discrimination. The head of human resources shifted uncomfortably. Sir, Patricia does have a history of issues with certain passengers. There have been complaints filed, but they were handled at the supervisor level. What kind of complaints, and why wasn't I informed? David demanded. Over the next hour, David learned that there had been at least 6 formal complaints against Patricia in the past 2 years, all from passengers of color who felt they had been treated unfairly. Each complaint had been dismissed or minimized by middle management, with Patricia receiving only minor counseling. David felt sick. His airline, the company he had built on principles of excellence and customer service, had been systematically failing passengers who deserved better. The discrimination against his sons wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that had been ignored for too long. I want a complete audit of all discrimination complaints filed in the past 5 years, David ordered. I want to know every incident, how it was handled, and what follow-up occurred, and I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning. As his executives scrambled to respond to his demands, David's phone rang. It was the airport calling to inform him that protesters were gathering outside the terminal, demanding justice for his sons. The story had grown beyond social media and was now attracting civil rights activists and local politicians. David realized that this crisis was bigger than just his family or even his company. It had become a symbol of the everyday discrimination that countless people faced, often without anyone paying attention or caring enough to demand change. His company jet was already in the air, heading to Chicago to pick up his sons. But David knew that bringing them home safely was only the beginning. He had a much bigger responsibility now, not just as a father seeking justice for his children, but as a business leader who had the power to create real change in an industry that clearly needed it. The phone kept ringing with media requests. Social media was exploding with outrage and support for his sons. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements, and somewhere in Chicago, Kai and Kyle were waiting for their ride home, probably still trying to process what had happened to them. David Thompson had built an airline empire, but now he faced the biggest challenge of his career, rebuilding it into something that truly lived up to the values he thought it already represented. By the time Kai and Kyle landed at their home airport that evening, their story had become national news. David Thompson met them at the private terminal, embracing his sons with tears in his eyes. The boys looked tired and emotionally drained, but they were home safe. I'm proud of how you handled yourselves today, David told them as they drove home. You showed grace and dignity in an impossible situation. But what happened to you should never happen to anyone, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. That night, David couldn't sleep. He spent hours reading the hundreds of comments and messages that had poured in from around the world. Some people shared their own stories of discrimination while traveling. Others praised his sons for remaining calm and respectful throughout their ordeal. Many demanded accountability and real change. The next morning, David called another emergency meeting, but this time he invited civil rights leaders, diversity experts, and even some of the passengers who had witnessed the incident. He wanted to hear from everyone who had been affected by what happened. I built this airline to be the best in the industry, David began. "But yesterday, I learned that being the best at moving planes from one city to another doesn't mean anything. If we're failing at treating people with basic human dignity." Patricia Coleman was terminated that morning, along with Captain Rodriguez and 3 supervisors who had mishandled previous discrimination complaints. But David knew that firing a few people wouldn't solve the deeper problem. Working with diversity consultants, David implemented sweeping changes throughout the airline. Every employee, from baggage handlers to senior executives, would undergo comprehensive bias training. The company established an independent ombudsman office to investigate discrimination complaints, removing the process from the chain of command that had failed so many passengers. David also completely restructured the airline's hiring and promotion practices. He set specific goals for increasing diversity at every level of the company and tied executive bonuses to meeting those targets. If his leadership team wanted to be rewarded, they would have to prove they could build an inclusive workplace. The changes went beyond policies and procedures. David promoted several employees of color to senior positions and created a diversity council with real authority to influence company decisions. He also established partnerships with historically black colleges and universities to create pipelines for future employees. Most importantly, David insisted on transparency. The airline would publish annual reports on discrimination complaints, diversity statistics, and progress toward inclusion goals. If they failed to meet their commitments, the public would know about it. Kai and Kyle returned to college the following week, but their experience had changed them. They began speaking at universities and conferences about discrimination and the importance of standing up for justice. Their story inspired other young people to share their own experiences and demand better treatment. "We learned that having privileges and advantages doesn't protect you from injustice," Kai told an audience at their university. "But it also means we have a responsibility to use our voices for people who might not be heard otherwise." The twins declined financial compensation from the airline, asking instead that the money be donated to civil rights organizations. They wanted their painful experience to benefit others who were fighting against discrimination. 6 months after the incident, Skyline Airways had been transformed. Employee surveys showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped to nearly zero. Most importantly, passengers of all backgrounds reported feeling welcomed and respected when they flew. The airline industry took notice. Other companies began adopting similar training programs and accountability measures. What had started as a humiliating experience for 2 college students had sparked industry-wide changes that benefited countless travelers. David often reflected on the irony of the situation. As a successful businessman, he had thought he was running an excellent company. It took seeing his own sons discriminated against to realize how much work still needed to be done. The incident had been devastating for his family, but it had also been a wake-up call that led to meaningful change. A year later, Skyline Airways won a national award for workplace diversity and inclusion. David accepted the award on behalf of his employees, but he knew the real credit belonged to his sons who had handled an impossible situation with dignity and then used their experience to help others. "Change is hard," David said in his acceptance speech. "It requires admitting that we haven't been as good as we thought we were. But the alternative, continuing to fail people who trust us with their business and their safety, is unacceptable." The video of Kai and Kyle being removed from the plane was still available online, a permanent reminder of what discrimination looked like and how it affected real people. But now it was accompanied by stories about the changes their experience had inspired and the progress that had been made. For the twins, the incident remained a painful memory, but it had also become a source of purpose. They had learned that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the most important changes, and that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but is always necessary. Their father had built a successful airline, but his sons had helped him build something more important, a company that truly valued every person who walked through its doors. The flight that was supposed to take them back to college had instead taken them on a journey toward justice, and that journey was far from over. Years later, when people asked David about the biggest challenge he had faced as a business leader, He didn't talk about economic downturns or industry competition. He talked about the day he learned that success without integrity is meaningless, and how his sons had taught him that real leadership means ensuring that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The twins never forgot what happened to them that Tuesday morning in Chicago. But they also never forgot the power they discovered in speaking up, standing together, and refusing to accept injustice as normal. Their story became proof that even the most painful experiences can become catalysts for positive change as long as people are willing to do the hard work of making things better.